Welcome to History 111, Lecture 38, Secession. As you may recall from previous lectures, the election of 1860 was a four-way race with the Democratic Party splitting in two. And here what we can see is that a very regional pattern emerges about how people vote. In the North and out in California and Oregon, people vote Republican, whereas in the South, they're voting very strongly for the Southern Democratic Party. Now, there's a couple of exceptions, with some people going with the Northern Democrats in places like Missouri and to a certain degree in New Jersey, and you see states that are going to be disputed in terms of which side do they really want to be on in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. In advance of the election, a lot of southern states declared that if a Republican president were elected, this would lead to secession, and the nullification crisis had really taught that no state government could stand alone against the feds. And South Carolina decides, though, to go ahead and test this and secede in December 1860. And a lot of the other southern states are watching because they remember the nullification crisis and they remember how it didn't work. Now, Buchanan, who is the president when this happens, his response is very weak. He says that secession is illegal, but he also says that the federal government has no power to stop a state from seceding. So in other words, he says you shouldn't do that, but does nothing else. Now, at this stage in time, there's a much bigger gap between the presidential election and the new president coming into office. So by the time Lincoln actually gets to Washington, D.C. and sworn in March of 1861, a total of 7 states have seceded. So in other words, 6 states sat back and watched South Carolina receive only a very token federal response, so they go ahead and join in. And in February of 1861, they had met in Montgomery, Alabama, and formed what they call the Confederate States of America. The Confederate States go ahead and start seizing all the federal property and arsenals within their boundaries, but 2 federal garrisons are going to remain, Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens. Now, South Carolina had been demanding the surrender of Fort Sumter, and Buchanan saw this as a major issue because, as President of the United States, looking after federal property was one of his constitutional duties, and he realized that he needs to send supplies and reinforcements to Fort Sumter to keep it going. But he's unwilling to use a military vessel because he regards that as an act of war and something that'll only make the crisis work. So he sends a civilian ship instead, and that ship is fired on and turns back. And what it really represents is that neither side is completely prepared to commit to a course of war at this stage. It's important to understand that in the early stages with Fort Sumter, people were still working on trying to bring the South back into the Union, and one of the more important efforts with that regard is the Crittenden Compromise, which was first proposed in December of 1860, and that compromise included a constitutional amendment to guarantee the permanent existence of slavery in the South, the reestablishment of the Missouri Compromise line, and it was accepted by the remaining Southerners in the Senate, but it's rejected by the Republicans. Now, when Lincoln takes office, he rejects the idea of the compromise altogether, and he gives an inaugural speech in which he declares that no state can succeed and he will put down the insurrection. But do realize that not everyone's on Lincoln's side. He has to actually go so far as to sneak into Washington, D.C. in disguise because of assassination attempts. Now, Lincoln, once he is in office, he's going to go ahead and force the Fort Sumter issue. The fort was running out of food and so on, so Lincoln is going to send supply ships. But he declares openly that he will not send troops or weapons unless South Carolina interferes. So what he's done is he's put this out there in a way that the South either has to back down and permit the ships to land and resupply the fort, or fire the first shots in the Civil War. And the actions that the Confederates choose is to go ahead and attack and take the fort. Now, the consequence of all this is that Lincoln is going to call for states to raise volunteer militias of 75,000 men to put down the rebellion, and he calls up these people on a 90-day contract. He only has 16,000 regular army troops, most of which are stationed in the West. He's going to get Congress to approve to increase that to 23,000, and he's going to have these 75,000 90-day volunteers. Now, keep in mind that within 16 days, just over 2 weeks, Ohio alone receives enough volunteers to fill that 75,000 quota, but other states are slower to respond. Now, another important consequence is once Lincoln starts raising an army to go to war with the South, 4 more states go ahead and secede and join them, that being Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. We should realize that even among slaveholding states, support for secession is not universal. There are 4 slave states, 2 divided and stay in the Union, albeit under direct military pressure. That's Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky. And realize Missouri and Kentucky have both a Union and Confederate government simultaneously, and people actually fighting it out for who's in control of the state. Ultimately, that's going to be settled in favor of the Union, but for a while, there's going to be chaos there. Now, Maryland and Delaware are occupied by the Army to prevent Washington, D.C. from being cut off. So basically, there's some states where people aren't exactly sure which side they want to be on, and do realize that even among states that seceded, there were divided loyalties, with some pockets not supporting the idea. So if we go ahead and look at this map, what we can see is that when it came to the issue of secession, some of these counties went ahead and voted against, and others had a mixed vote. So by no means was this something that was universally supported by everyone in the state, albeit this was something that was supported by the majority of their state. Now, splitting the country like this is also going to leave the Republicans back in the North with an unchallenged majority in Congress, and they're going to go ahead and take on a program of economic nationalism. Importantly, the Homestead Act of 1862 is going to allow people to live on land for 5 years and gain title to it for a small fee, and they're going to use that to help settle some areas of the West. They're going to create land grants to states and create a lot of universities, and they're going to bring in the highest level of import tariffs in history that they're going to help protect and sponsor American industry, so that by 1862, the Union war industries are completely self-sufficient. In other words, the United States can produce all of its war materials at home. Another significant Republican program are going to be the National Bank Acts, and those are voluntary, and banks, if they have enough capital and invest 1/3 of government securities, are allowed to join, but once they join, they're allowed to issue treasury notes as currency, and that's going to finally bring in a standardized US dollar. And income tax will also be levied for the first time to help pay for the war, but the government's also going to start issuing greenbacks, and these are, again, large numbers of notes that are backed by good faith and credit and not by gold. And the value of greenbacks is going to tend to be directly related to the outcome of battles, and it's going to cause significant inflation during the course of the war. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, there's a very slow and weak response under Buchanan, but when Lincoln comes in office, that is going to change. Now, both sides have mixed feelings about how to proceed, but the South generally has a higher level of commitment to their cause. But importantly, back in the North, the withdrawal of Southern Democrats is going to leave Republicans with more or less complete control of Congress. See you in the next lecture.